Hello and welcome to StuffTV. I'm your host, Nick Huzar, also the co-founder of OfferUp. And I've spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand how my own life impacts the planet. And I found it really complicated. So I just started to create this podcast and interview really interesting thought leaders to help enlighten us. And with me today, I've got Jeremy Walters, who's the sustainability ambassador for Republic Services. And Republic Services is a monster. I guess a big company. And so I think Jeremy was going to have a really good view on how to talk about waste management in the U.S. So, Jeremy, thanks for being here. Would love to maybe start with a quick intro on, how did you get into this business?
Oh, well, it depends on how far you want to go back. But growing up, I've always had an inherent love for the environment, animals in particular, if you can't tell about the saltwater aquarium behind me. But, just being out in nature and seeing things alive and thriving, and that, waste doesn't play a role in sitting in the environment. And so I actually went to school for environmental studies. And then Republic, back in 2015, opened up one of the largest residential recycling centers in North America, right here in Las Vegas. And I remember going to the grand opening and I said, wow, this is impressive. This is something that is going to move the needle and really be impactful for sustainability, not just, in Southern Nevada, but neighboring regions. And then when we look at Republic at, the national scale, the things that the company is doing, it's just so impressive. I knew I had to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds like I remember when I was starting OfferUp, everyone was starting these e-commerce sites. I was like, wait, that's over here. I'm more interested in the waste side of things. So I think you have to have that in the DNA where, I kept asking, where does all the Amazon stuff go? Where's everything going? That was some of the first questions I started to ask myself. Man, we're producing a lot. Where is it all going? And
you're right in thinking that. And it's one of those things that until you work in the industry or you become curious enough to learn about it, it's a little out of sight, out of mind, right? I wheel my carts out every Thursday. I got a trash cart. I got a recycling cart. It gets picked up without fail and it goes somewhere and something happens to it. But, when you think about how many times a day that's happening all over the country and how much waste people produce, to some, it may give you a little bit of an existential crisis when you think about it. But, that's where we come in, right? And we're here to manage these materials in the most environmentally responsible way that we can.
Yeah, one of the stats I've referred to a number of times on this podcast, which is interesting, is in the U.S., the average person will live to be, I think, is about 74 years old, and will produce about 128,000 pounds of trash in a lifetime. So if you just do that math times the number of people in the U.S., that's 42 trillion pounds of trash. And you're like, what the heck? So if you think about it, even the last 100 years, there's so many amazing things that have occurred in humanity over the last 100 years that we've all benefited from. And I don't think a lot of us ever thought about it at the time, that the downsides or the kind of the byproduct of some of this. 100 years ago, we were still trading kind of, pelts for gunpowder, right? Not everyone had a car yet. And so I think it's really kind of a really rapid evolution that humanity's had to deal with. And now I think we're also at a stage where, what got us here is not going to get us there. And it's great to see companies start to, think of all these processes and things that have impacted humanity, but also saying, do we have to always do it the same way?
Yeah. And, it's interesting when you talk about history and how things have developed, consumer behavior has just, evolved so significantly. When we think about, traditional waste systems, recycling has long been a part of human nature, human culture. It's just in a different way, right? When something broke, you actually kept it and you fixed it, or maybe, you worked on it, right? Or you used other parts to make something else. And so the idea of recycling and reuse it's nothing new, but in the way that we're used to it these days, it's to support our consumer behavior, right? We consume something and then we need to discard of it. And hopefully there's a market for it that it can then be turned into something usable again.
What are some of the biggest challenges in recycling that you see?
Yeah, so the recycling rate over the last handful of decades has grown significantly, but it's still hovering in the low 30%. I think
Yeah.
it's somewhere around 32%. So a lot of work to be done there. And it isn't necessarily because things can't be recycled. It's just simply that, us as consumers, we potentially aren't putting these things in the recycling bin to begin with. Or a subset of that is that, we're eager to recycle and we throw the wrong thing in the bin. We become a wish cycler, right? You throw something in the
Yeah.
bin, unsure if it can be recycled or not. And then you actually do more harm than good, whether it be to the process itself or, contaminating other good recyclables along the way. So, definitely room for improvement. Recycling infrastructure across the United States, recycling accessibility. Just about every single major metropolitan area has some level of either curbside or single stream, all in one recycling, whatever you want to call it. Rural areas, you can see that there's some disparity there in terms of access, but there's a lot of access to recycling. And so that's where, again, us as consumers, we really have a role to play that, when we drink a water bottle or, a soda bottle, we got to take it home and recycle it if there's not something out in the community. Because once something goes into the trash stream, largely it's not being recovered, right? It's pretty impossible to sort through the trash to try to pull out good recoverable materials.
Mm.
You can capture some things, right? Some other things are more resilient than others, and they're going to be beverage containers largely, right? A glass bottle, a plastic bottle, but they're very soiled and they're very difficult to market. And that's why it's so important that, when you have materials that are good recyclable materials, they go in the recycling bin. You can't confuse the fact that, it looks like the same trucks coming by the house, they're, especially with Republic, they're all big blue trucks.
Yeah.
They look like
one came by yesterday.
Yeah, there you go. Right. But it's a different truck that's actually picking up the material and taking it to an entirely different facility for a completely separate process. So it's imperative that we put those things in the right bin.
And do you have, like, my sister lives in Orange County and maybe she's not doing it, but she's like, oh, we just throw it in one bin. They figure it out. I said, I don't think so.
Yeah, I have family in Orange County as well, particularly in Laguna Niguel.
Yes, right here. That's the same area.
Yeah. So I know who the service provider is down there. And, that's largely what's going to be happening is that if you're throwing every single thing that you are throwing away into one bin, you are going to lose a good portion of recoverable materials, right? Fiber is what we call paper and cardboard largely. And if that gets soiled with food and liquid, it's trash now. So, those mixed waste systems, they're not the most efficient because you do lose good, valuable materials in the process.
Yeah. Can you maybe, stepping back at a macro level, just explain to people back, you said this a little bit earlier, when I think most of us, we throw things in the trash and we're like, oh, we're back on to our daily life. I'll probably overlay a picture I took for Earth Day. I laid in a pile of my family's trash for a year. So I did a week's worth, and we laid in a football field, and then we shot this football field with a drone, used Photoshop to cut and paste by 52. So I was like, I wonder what that would look like. And it looked like you would imagine. It looked way messed up. You're like, there's no way I'm producing this much. And you realize you do. Like, I think as a family, we're pretty environmentally conscious. But I wouldn't say we're super extremist at all. Like, and part of it was, I think we're far more now, we're getting more and more that way because we're learning through just doing this show of like, oh, where does it make sense and where does it not? But again, it was kind of eye opening for me going through that process. So,
yeah. So, again, trash goes through an entirely different process, recycling to another. And, depending on locale, the intermediary process, if you will, can look slightly different. But largely it's the same, right? Recycling is going to what we refer to as a MRF. It's MRF. It's Material Recovery Facility Recycling Center, right? So we take all the mixed commodities there. It's run through a fairly automated system. Most systems these days are pretty automated, that they have machines doing an initial separation. We're separating them into individual commodity streams, right? It's just cardboard. It's just paper. It's just glass, aluminum, tin, the different grades of plastic. People are there as well, and they're following up with quality control. And then once materials are separated, we bale them and then we ship them off to be turned into new materials. trash is different in a way that, it's still collected at the curb. Sometimes it goes to a transfer station, transferred onto a larger truck, depending on the proximity of the landfill to the service area. And then ultimately it's dropped in the landfill. But landfills themselves, there's a lot of misconceptions around what they are and what they do. And, they've changed significantly in the last handful of decades as well. You can look up something called Subtitle D, and Subtitle D really changed the rules and regulations of how a landfill is set up. And there's a lot of environmental protections that go into the engineering of a landfill, liner systems, gas wells, leachate collection systems. And so essentially when the trash is dropped there, it's compacted. Compaction is really how we extend the life of a landfill and really maximize the space that we're working with. And then ultimately, it's covered with what we call final cover, and it's going to be dirt. Again, depending on the locale, one thing that Republic Services has really been doubling down on is realizing that in a landfill, you've got essentially two byproducts of waste. One is going to be a liquid waste. It's called leachate. It's kind of like a gray water.
But they said lychee before, and that's what my wife drinks that, and that tastes like liquid waste to me.
Yeah, the leachate would probably be significantly worse tasting, but lychee, I'm with you. It doesn't taste very good either. But we pull that out of the hill, and we manage it in different ways. Some places around the country, when we have closed sites, we do what's called phytoremediation. So we actually use this leachate to water specifically selected poplar trees or vetiver grasses, and they're using the constituents of leachate, heavy metals and things like that, as micro and macronutrients to fuel their growth. So they're also sequestering carbon through their growth, right? Naturally through photosynthesis, but us having to reduce the amount of tanker trips to take leachate out to a water treatment facility or to another area to treat it. But one of the really cool things that I was mentioning that we're doubling down on is renewable energy, right? So the other byproduct of landfills is primarily methane gas. And so this is a naturally occurring byproduct in a landfill. And we realize that this can be turned into either power, right, through landfill gas to energy, or through some of our most recent joint venture initiatives with Archaea Energy. We're going to be taking landfill gas and making it into RNG, and that can be used in fleets. So it's going to be a low carbon fuel source for fleet vehicles.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do think the future, I'm optimistic. We talked about, if you think about globalization, there's a lot of great things that came out of that. But also what you think about is like all this stuff that's just accumulating locally. And so it seems like, how do you tap into that more? To us as consumers, the value is now gone. It's in the trash. But that doesn't mean there's still not value in there to be had, potential economic upsides to kind of leveraging some of this. And I think that's one perfect example. And at the same time, you're solving I think one of our biggest challenges in our lifetime is going to be, how do we harness energy more? Electricity demand and demands on our grid, especially in the next 30 years, is going to be significant. The EV adoption is awesome. Like, we continue to exceed kind of some of the expectations of what that's going to be. But where are we in 10 years? There's like we'll talk about EV charging stations. There's like 160,000 of them in the US. I think by 2030, we need to have 2 million of them to keep up the demand. How are we going to do things like that? So I think it's really interesting how you're leveraging that and the scale. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Republic Services has 17,000 trucks today or something?
Yeah, today about 17,000. And we do also operate some other vehicles on the road running on RNG. I think about 21% of those 17,000 are running on RNG. So we've got investments there. In the next 5 years, though, we anticipate that half of our new truck purchases are going to be electric, though.
Those are not. One, I'm sure those trucks are not cheap already, and now they're going to have these huge batteries in them. Are you thinking about potentially leveraging? Just charging them on site? Like, how does that going to work? Because you could, if you're producing your own energy.
Yeah. So, there are some places that could make sense, but we're working with public utilities in our hauling yards, because generally speaking, where the truck's birthed from is different than where they go to dispose of something. sometimes they're simultaneous, right? A landfill could have a hauling yard, but our hauling yards where we're putting EVs, we really are investing in putting the infrastructure there as well. And we have seen with some other players in the space that if they're looking at electrification efforts, they don't actually have the infrastructure to manage it. And so that's something that we're really focused on, is that when we're looking to roll out these EVs, that we have infrastructure at our facilities that, when the truck is done servicing the route for the day, it goes and gets hung up on the charger and it's ready to go the next day.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. When you think about, there's a few other things that you were sharing about the future, let's say the next 5 years or so, or even beyond. Like, what are things that get you super excited? And you mentioned a few different innovations I thought were interesting, and just how do you repurpose some of these products so they can be utilized locally versus today people are sourcing from across the world to bring these things here. And I mean, you're just trying to figure out, like, how can you get these things out into the local kind of ecosystem, right?
Yeah. And, something that you had mentioned earlier is kind of about the economics involved with sustainability. And for us, we view that sustainability isn't just our responsibility, but it's also an opportunity, right? And that economic sustainability and environmental sustainability, they're inextricably linked, right? We have true opportunity there. And one of those things, the one that gets me really excited, is Polymer Center. So in today's world, largely, when you go and you recycle a water bottle, for example, it's not always recycled into a water bottle again. Most of the time, it's going to be downcycled into synthetic fibers for clothes or carpeting, something other than itself, right? With Polymer Center, we're really trying to advance circularity. We want to make a bottle become a bottle again. And in Las Vegas later this year, we're going to be opening up the first of a handful of Polymer Centers, where once we separate the materials at the recycling center, we take those bales to polymer and then we break them up. We can grind them into flake. We can separate the cap and the ring from the bottle. It can go through a wash process and a drying process, and then ultimately back out on market. There's strong demand for these materials, and especially, right now, you can look up something called extended producer responsibility, and more large CPG companies are looking to bring recycled content back in their packaging, and there's actually legislation that may demand that from them in the near future. So currently, there's not infrastructure that can help meet that demand. But that's exactly what Polymer Center is going to be doing. And so when we open up this national network of these Polymer Centers, where we're going to be directly advancing that bottle-to-bottle circularity, it's something it's pretty impressive. I actually just was over there yesterday. It's still in the construction phase, but all the equipment is inside the building. And I just am so impressed with the engineers that come up with the pieces of equipment that work in the process, how they fit it into a building. It's truly going to be, in my opinion, something very revolutionary for the environmental services industry.
And key, I mean, I harp a lot on plastics. There's a lot of good that's come out of plastics, but like plastic water bottles, I go postal. Like, it's just like, we produce 500 billion of these a year on the globe. And it is, when I was a kid, we didn't even drink water. And I think about it, like, we drink soda, like, and juice, reuse that locally. Like, such a massive one, I think it's a massive economic opportunity for sure. But then two, also should have a huge impact, on the environment.
It will. And, the key thing, though, to remember is that, again, us as consumers, we do have a responsibility that when we consume these materials, we got to make sure that they end up in the bin. And without that, that's where I think plastics can start to get a bad rap. You're right. There's a lot of things in our daily lives that are made possible by plastic, but, we tend to focus, I think, on the wrong material sometimes. There's some statistics out there that kind of take you down the rabbit hole, if you will, right? Saying, only 5% of plastics gets recycled. And there's a layer of truth to that. But when you kind of start peeling back the layers of that onion, you start to realize that global plastics production isn't just limited to a water bottle. It's, it's your microphone. It's my headphones.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, yeah. Right? And so when we look at global plastics production and it's contributing to a recycling rate, not everything that's created is intended to be recycled.
Yeah.
So that's where, when we start getting down to a little bit more of a micro level, if you will, and we're looking at consumer materials, bottles, jugs, tubs that have the ability to be recycled, yes, we want to make sure that we're reducing our impact. We're using less of those things when and where possible. But when we do use them, when we do consume from them, make sure that they go in the recycling bin, because they are valuable in this big chain of a process, and they will continue to be valuable and become more valuable as producers are looking to add more content, recycled content to their packaging.
What do you think, to that point around consumers, like for anybody watching this, like what would you say to them has the biggest impact in your business? Like what are things consumers should be doing that really, let's say I mess up and I put the wrong thing in the wrong bin, or batteries. I've heard a lot of horror stories about batteries and fires causing millions of dollars in damage. And what are things that you wish every consumer would know about? And if they just made those changes, it would sure make an impact.
So I'll start with the easy one before I jump into this one. Plastic bags, flexible plastics, probably one of the single biggest issues that we see day to day at our recycling centers. All they do is wrap and tangle around the sorting equipment. Think about a vacuum cleaner, right? If you're vacuuming your house, I've got a little bit longer hair, as do you, and my wife does, right? Over time, the rollers of a vacuum, if you don't clean them out, they get tangled with hair, and that vacuum cleaner becomes inefficient. Well, that same principle applies. We're utilizing disc screens that are rotating, and when you throw in a grocery bag or that bubble wrap from your Amazon packaging or the satchel, they wrap and tangle, right? So when we can try to cut things out of our daily lives, that is so much more impactful. Flexible plastics don't belong in your recycling bin. You shouldn't be bagging your recyclables. So cut that out. That's an easy one.
I always do that. I have the trash bag that all of the recycle goes in, but then I empty the trash in and I take that bag and I end up putting the bag in the trash.
Yeah. And that's where it belongs. But like when you go to the grocery store, get in the habit of bringing your own bags. I know that it is sometimes a tedious job. You go into the store and you forget them. I made a shift in our lives many years ago because we weren't perfect, right? And I still am not perfect. Every once in a while I'll get a grocery bag, but we made it a habit that it's like if we forgot our grocery bags, you got to carry it all out. After you do it 4 or 5 times, you're like, I'm going to remember the bags next time.
I harp on 2 things to this point. You're hitting the bullseye for me. One is I talk about plastic water bottles in this all the time. And the other one is the grocery bag. So if you look at 25% of the waste in our oceans, it's those 2 things. It's plastic water bottles and it's plastic bags. So for me, like you said, the change in habit didn't happen right away. We now treat our plastic water bottles like getting dressed. And it's probably taken years. I have little kids. So when we leave the house, it's like, oh, you're getting your shoes on. Well, where's your water bottle? And we've gotten so hardcore about it now. Like we'll go out and eat Thai food. My kids are like, well, sometimes they'll give you water, but it depends on where we're going. They're like, Dad, I need water. I'm like, well, sorry, you didn't bring your water bottle. And so I'm not going to go get you, a water bottle. And then the plastic bags, the change in behavior I had to do because I realized we have a bunch of those, the reusable bags, but they were always in my trunk. So I'd always go in there and I did exactly what you say. Standing there and like, do you want a bag? I'm like, nope, I'm just going to carry this. The change though, is I started putting it in the pocket of my driver's side door. So when I got out, I always know it's there and I just grab it now. So that was one little change in behavior that seemed to help.
Yeah. And behavioral changes are, what really drive our recycling habits. And, once it becomes routine, these things, they don't become difficult to do. And it's the bag thing, right? It's just remembering to put it in a more convenient spot so you grab it next time you go in the store. But yeah, that makes a significant impact. I think I read a statistic a handful of years ago that it said one reusable bag will save about 22,000 single-use plastic bags in its lifetime. And again, it's huge. Kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, right? When you think about, okay, that's 22,000 for me, but it's 22,000 for you. Yep. It's 22,000 for everyone I know, right? Do the math.
What was the other thing? So you talked about bags,
batteries, electronics. Again, consumer behavior, right? I feel like every couple months there's a brand new one of these out on the market. People, I think they look at a cell phone, laptop, electronic device, and they say, okay, it's got a glass screen, it's got metal components, there's plastic components. and potentially by themselves, they're recyclable. But again, confusing the idea either with reuse, that reuse constitutes recycling, or that, these things can be recycled. They throw it in the bin, not understanding that a lithium battery is one of the scariest things that our industry has been facing over the last handful of years. And it's only becoming more prevalent. When one of these gets cracked or punctured or bent, they potentially explode. And if you think about what's at a recycling facility, paper and cardboard and plastic, which is petroleum based, these fires can become exponential, and they pose serious risks to the employees that work there, neighboring communities. But we have been implementing more and more fire suppression systems. Fire Rover is one in particular, where we actually have infrared imaging of the pile of recyclables before it's processed. We can see a hot spot and potentially extinguish it before it becomes problematic. But some of the older facilities that don't have them or have them yet, it's still a risk every day. But that risk isn't just limited to the recycling center. It can also be at your curb, right? The truck that's picking up these materials, they've got compactors in the back. And if they're compacting that material, I've seen it a handful of times in my lifetime where a truck has to dump the material out on the roadway. Otherwise, the whole truck burns down because there's, potentially a lithium battery or some other flammable material in there. It's important to understand that e-waste, specifically things that are rechargeable with a lithium battery, they don't go in your regular trash bin. They don't go in your regular recycling bin.
Yeah.
They have to go to an electronics recycler, whether you take it to a Best Buy or you utilize a mail-back program of some sort. They cannot go in your curbside bins.
Yeah. I think here there's certain days, or I think I can take my batteries, which I just put in a big bag, and if I leave it on the one of the trash, they'll hand take it out separately. But I know that was a newer thing that we started doing.
Yeah, and we do have some communities around the United States that will have those little battery collection programs. But the alkaline batteries themselves are less problematic than something like a lithium battery. The lithium battery, just think simply for a consumer or anybody watching, right? Anything that's rechargeable, consider that it's got that hazard, right? It's got that fire potential, and you got to take it to a designated electronics recycler. A lot of the cell phone carriers as well, you can donate your old electronics back to them. If they're still usable, I know especially with like iPhones and Androids, they're still valuable even if they're a generation or two old. So you can sell them, right? You could sell them on OfferUp. You could sell them through
shameless plug.
Through some shameless plug, right? You could sell them through something like that. But as they become older, if they're still usable, consider donating them. I can't remember the carrier, but the program is called Cell Phones for Soldiers. And, you can donate them there, and then they can send them overseas to soldiers, and, they can put minutes on them. So there's a lot of great opportunities to keep things out of the waste stream. And that's really what we should be doing is, thinking about how we can keep things out of the trash or even out of the recycling stream. Donation, reuse, those are all first and foremost before it comes to the disposal side of things.
Mm-hmm. So plastic bags, lithium batteries, are those the biggest ones?
Those are the biggest ones. And then I would say that, again, kind of tagging on to, it's centered around recycling, right? Because that's where consumers, they want to do the most that they can, and not understanding some of the implications of doing it wrong. Residual food and liquid can be problematic, right? We do have to rinse out our recyclables, and it's a gentle, quick rinse, right? I'm not saying take a peanut butter jar and sit there and scrub it with soap and water for 30 minutes, right? But, if you've got a pasta sauce jar, right? A little bit of residual sauce in there, squirt some water in there, swirl it around, tap it dry, throw it in the bin. And the reason that we ask you to do that is something we touched on earlier. And the reason we don't explore that mixed waste process is that you lose paper and cardboard along the way. If it gets soiled with food and liquid, we got to throw it away. Right?
So you're saying I've always debated, this is helpful because I kind of do what you do. I give it a quick rinse, but it's not totally scrubbed out. And so I think that's always the thing people worry about. Am I wasting more water than, is it more harmful because I'm standing there scrubbing this thing? I just do a quick rinse. I'm not super thorough, but sounds like that's okay.
Yeah, a quick rinse is fine. And again, we talk about, making small habit changes. set a couple of the bottles and jars on the sink, and next time you're getting ready to do some dishes when you already have the water running, throw that through the rotation, and then you're good to go. One thing I will shamelessly plug about Las Vegas is we are considered a town of excess, but we do a really good job.
When did that
Yeah.
happen?
No, I know the lights and the casinos.
Yeah.
But when we talk about water here, actually, water is a precious resource.
Oh, yeah.
And our Las Vegas Valley Water District, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, they've all done a really tremendous job in modeling how wastewater is treated. Anything that I put down the drain comes right back out the tap at some point.
I've heard about this in Vegas, like everything, even the outside watering, the golf course at the Wynn gets reused. And so, I mean, hallelujah, because you're in the middle of a desert. But I've heard about how great that Las Vegas reuses all the water.
Yeah, it's pretty tremendous. And so there's other places around the country that are like that. But definitely, if you live somewhere, I think I've read recent headlines about some of the water issues in Arizona, right? Be cognizant of that. And, you don't have to wash your recyclables out so they're, spit shine clean. It's a really quick rinse and then throw it in the recycling bin.
If you want to go super extreme, you could do what my grandmother did. She lived during the Great Depression. She would rinse everything again and again and reuse it. And that's great. Like if you can get it off and reuse tinfoil, like why not? But I'm talking down to like dirty, like saran wrap. I would go in there. She's like, "Oh, I'm going to eat something out of the fridge." And I could see what it was wrapped in. And I'd say, "Okay, now we've gone too far."
Yeah, that's a bit of a stretch, pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe one other question I think could be interesting too, and you and I kind of touched on this before. Manufacturing. This is maybe a question more about government and policy. When we drive down the street, we know what a red, green, and yellow light means, and it's very simple. And you can go any city in the U.S. and you know what that is. But when it comes to disposing of things, you need a PhD, and even then, it's very localized. Like what I can do potentially here versus what you do versus what my sister does. It's all very different. And manufacturing, you look at the recycling, the little arrows in there, like they mean, I don't even know anymore. And so I think that is a big challenge for almost every consumer. And you just don't. I'll give you another example. At OfferUp headquarters, we have compostable utensils and cups. Nobody even knew. It wasn't until like an all hands. I'm like, wait, those are compostable? I didn't know that for years. And so I think that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest opportunities in the US. But I don't know how we're going to evolve packaging unless the government steps in and says, no, we're going to simplify the system. And if we could simplify it at the source, think of the repercussions of that. But I don't know, like we're such a consumer society. It seems like almost insurmountable to think through that. But it just seems like a big opportunity to me.
It is an opportunity, and the good news is that it is starting to happen. And actually, I figured we would get on this topic, and I brought an example with me. So I don't know if you can see it, but right here,
yes,
right, little triangle. That's a triangle, not the recycling symbol. With plastics in particular, that's called the resin identification code, and it is very misleading for consumers, right? They automatically see that, and it mirrors the recycling symbol, so they think, well, that goes in the recycling bin, right? And then it goes in there, and now that plastic bag is a problem. So recent legislation, it's localized to the states. You're seeing some in California, I believe Oregon, Maine. There's a handful of others. There's some things called truth in labeling. And what they're requiring is that manufacturers of goods, they actually have to truly be recyclable before they can put something on there. And they're talking about doing away with that resin identification code.
Oh, yes.
That was created back in, I think it was the 60s at some point. It was trying to create some level of, uniform understanding of what types of things, are made from certain types of polymers. But all it's done is it's create confusion for the consumers.
So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, so we probably will see more of that in the near future. That truth in labeling will probably start to gain a foothold. Legislation, especially when we're talking about the manufacturing of goods, right? We can see it with some of the EV policies. Once it gains a foothold in California, the size of their economy really dictates what happens on a large scale.
Yeah.
So I think that if it happens in California, we'll start to see it trickle out elsewhere. Another interesting law to look up would be extended producer responsibility. And similar enough, what it's trying to tackle is that when a manufacturer makes something, that they actually need to have processes in place to vet whether or not it can truly be recycled. They're actually responsible for it going back into the circular economy and becoming something again. So those are two things to keep an eye out for: is truth in labeling and extended producer.
I love both those. So, one of the thing I really want to get after, it's, there's a few other companies that I'm trying to support, and it's back to labeling. So when I was a kid, I don't recall when I was born if there was really nutrition labels, and then they became more of a thing. I think in the 90s, they really took off to what they were. Like, nobody talked about calories when I was a kid. And then now it's more of a thing. And you can read about, everyone's always looking at all the labels. I think we should have in all of our labels, what was the impact of that product? And it should be like a carbon, however you want to do it. I think carbon's an easy one to do. And that should be on there. So at least as a consumer, it should just be under the nutrition fact. What was the impact of this product to our planet? So, I'm trying to find creative ways to help support, there's a number of companies trying to do this. And, I've been researching the nutrition facts, the credit score. Like, how did you start with these things? And then how did they become mainstream? It takes a while. It takes years to figure this out. But I think that's one important thing. And then the second thing you said, which I think is spot on, is manufacturers need to have some level of accountability for what they're producing. And you can't just say, I'm just going to produce the most toxic thing and make tons of profit. It's like, no. Like Coca-Cola, if you're producing 100 million, I'm just making this up, 100 million plastic water bottles, you should be accountable to some degree to like what happens with those. And hopefully if this trend continues, then companies like that start to say, oh, okay, now I'm going to put a little bit more time and effort into building more sustainable packaging. I just don't want to deal with that anymore. So that's my hope with that. I think that goes for any businesses. They should be, one, consumers should know what was the impact of that product is. And then two, manufacturers need to have some level of accountability, which is, I think today they just don't. They manufacture it, and then companies like yours has to figure out what to do with all of it.
Yeah, and I think that you're on the track, and I think companies like Coke, they will start to, again, when we're talking about Polymer Center, right, and feeding that void, I think that it will come. I think maybe not at necessarily the micro level where they're talking about carbon impact of the production of the material, but definitely more of that extended producer responsibility or using more recycled content in their packaging. And I think more and more of these brand owners are kind of tracking that way. So it'll be interesting to see how things shake out in the very near future. Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, this is really insightful. I really love how we kind of talk through so many different aspects of just our waste system. And it is a huge challenge that I think everyone can relate to. So I really appreciate you for being here.
Yeah. Happy to be here. Anytime you want to talk trash, I'm your guy.
Yeah. Talk trash. There we go. Maybe that's the title of the podcast when we put it out there.
Yeah. Talking trash.
Yeah. Talking trash. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again.
Hey, thanks, Nick.